Welcome to the Jagged podcast, discussions of literature and life. This is Dr. Paul Hamilton, and I'm here with Professor Hunter Reeve. And what we're going to do today is we're going to discuss time and eternity, and we're going to discuss some of Professor Reeve's poems on time and eternity, and also Emily Dickinson's. We plan to have a far-reaching discussion about these poems and their connection to our lives and our thinking about life and about death. And we invite you to join us by commenting, sending us email about your impressions of our discussion or your contributions to it. Professor Reeve, welcome, and this is our first podcast. Could you please introduce yourself?
Yeah, thank you very much, Dr. Hamilton. I'm Professor Hunter Reeve, and I'm a professor emeritus from Monterey Peninsula College in Monterey, California. And I've written poetry since I was 15 years old. And I've been fascinated, even as a youth, on the time and eternity themes because I've often had visions of my own throughout my life. And the poem I'd like to read tonight of my own is called Nature's Chapel. And at the end, the last two lines, I touch upon time and eternity. And
So
I'm
that
very
sounds
happy.
absolutely lovely. That sounds really lovely. And would you like to read it
Yes.
now? Oh,
Okay.
great.
Nature's Chapel. I see visions in the orange green mountains. I smell fragrance of the yellow rose. I walk among red poppy fields, listening to sacred spiritual music. The slight mist provides a token of heaven. This nature becomes my chapel. So on the last two lines, I touch upon heaven and eternity. And I mentioned heaven. The slight mist provides a token of heaven. This nature becomes my chapel. And the whole poem, indeed, was a vision that I had. And as I said, it was inspired by Emily Dickinson and her philosophy, which we'll be discussing. Dr. Hamilton, did you want to say anything about the poem?
Yes, I mean, I think that what this line that you mentioned, the slight mist becomes a token of heaven. This nature becomes my chapel, a token of heaven. It it seems to me like an intimation of immortality, a kind of vision that is sort of redolent with a sense of the eternal. And I think that this is very Dickinsonian in the sense that in Dickinson, of course, we always see her um, talking about this, crossing this traversing this gulf from time to eternity, seeing in nature symbols of eternity. And I think it's very appropriate that we open with that poem, this kind of visionary landscape that you describe here, that becomes more and more reverberant or redolent with a sense of eternity.
Well, thank you very much. Would you like to read Emily Dickinson's Because I Could Not Stop for Death?
Yeah, sure.
Great.
So this is Emily Dickinson's most famous poem. It's the most frequently anthologized poem. And it is also a kind of visionary poem. This is explicitly about her envisioning her own death. Because I could not stop for death, he kindly stopped for me. The carriage held but just ourselves and immortality. We slowly drove, he knew no haste, and I put away my labor and my leisure too for his civility. We passed the school where children strove at recess in the ring. We passed the fields of gazing grain. We passed the setting sun, or rather, he passed us. The dews grew quivering and chill, for only gossamer my gown, my tippet only tulle. We paused before a house that seemed a swelling of the ground. The roof was scarcely visible, the cornice in the ground. Since then 'tis centuries, and yet feels shorter than the day I first surmised the horses' heads were toward eternity. So this poem begins by describing death as personified in the form of a suitor or someone who's courting the speaker of the poem. And he gradually takes the speaker of the poem on this sort of visionary carriage ride back through past a schoolyard, past the fields of gazing grain, past the setting sun, and it progressively becomes more and more of a visionary landscape as it goes. She realizes then that she's not dressed for this encounter, for only gossamer my gown, my tippet only tulle. Her gown is like gossamer, and her tippet, which is a scarf, is just this fine webbed thread until she arrives at her grave, a house that seemed a swelling of the ground. And the poem becomes progressively more surreal. The roof was scarcely visible, the cornice in the ground. Since then 'tis centuries, and yet feels shorter than the day I first surmised the horses' heads were towards eternity. And suddenly time telescopes at the end, so that centuries have passed, and yet somehow feels shorter than the day that she's describing of her death. And then she exits into eternity. um, there's a lot to talk about here, but would you like to make any initial comments, Professor Reeve?
Yes, I would. I think that, first of all, Emily Dickinson is very courageous in her thoughts, her philosophy, and her imbued in her poetry because she is able to talk about issues that many poets, particularly at that time, didn't want to talk about. And she starts, of course, as Dr. Hamilton said, talking about death at the outset. And I think it's also what Dr. Hamilton touched upon, a journey of the soul. And she's, it's, it has a lot of movement to me. I mean, she's looking down and she's in this carriage riding along, and she passes the school where children strove at recess in the ring. And that, to me, is she's going back to childhood and looking at that. And then, as Dr. Hamilton said, at the end is she's going toward eternity. And it's many poets, they describe something and they get to maybe an ending that is not about death or eternity, and it stops. And Emily Dickinson is able to go beyond the mundane into talking of immortality. eternity and time. What did you think, Dr. Hamilton?
Yeah, I think I think that, the first thing that I would consider what you talk about her going um, beyond death into eternity, and I think that raises this issue of the point of view of the poem, which is a kind of post-mortem point of view, which is incredibly strange. And I think that she's the first person to adopt that kind of point of view, and certainly the most famous. I don't know of any other great poems that adopt that point of view. She
Well,
adopts the same point of view in a couple other poems as well, including her poem "I Heard a Fly Buzz When I Died," and "I Felt a Funeral in My Brain." It's a kind of um, um, you know post mortem recounting of death. And
yes.
I, yeah. Mhm.
Yeah, I just want to mention that in a lot of her poetry, she mentions nature and then goes beyond that. She's able to study nature in a very finite, definitive way. And what were you saying, Dr. Hamilton?
Well, I was just saying that this it's a very unusual point of view, and it's one that she adopts in several poems, and I think it's very effective. Also, I mean, I have to say, quite creepy, but very effective, and very you kind of dislocating. I mean, um, I want to say surreal because it really is. Where is this voice coming from? It's a voice from beyond the grave. It's a
Yes,
voice from immortality, as she puts it, from eternity.
yes, definitely. And as I say, she's able to describe the journey and also the movement of the journey, which I think is pretty spectacular.
Well, let's then talk. Would you mind of if we talk about it stanza by stanza? We just kind of go on that journey with her, and then we can discuss the imagery and the language. Because I could not stop for death, kindly stop for me. The carriage held but just ourselves in immortality. So in this stanza, she could not stop for death, but he kindly death is depicted as this kind of courteous gentleman suitor who stops his carriage for her. And immortality is also personified. Immortality is personified as the chaperone of this strange courtship between her and death. Immortality is also in the carriage, and is sort of presiding over this courtship. I've always felt that this line is, and she repeats the word stop here twice. It's very an important word. This line is very important. I could not stop for death. She cannot stop for death because none of us can stop our own clock, our own internal clock that holds us in time. So death stops for her. On the one hand, death is stopping his carriage, and on the other hand, death is stopping her clock. And this is reminiscent or recalls another poem um, that's very famous that she wrote called "A Clock Stopped, Not the Mantles." A clock stopped. um, not the mantles. And this poem, she in the poem "A Clock Stopped," she explicitly uses a clock in order to symbolize the passage from time into eternity. And in this poem, in a person dying and their passage from time into eternity, in this poem, um, the clock stops, and that symbolizes this movement from time into eternity. So we can get back to that other poem, to A Clock Stopped, in a little bit, but I just wanted to mention that she's concerned in a number of poems about this passage from time into eternity. So yeah, so this, because I could not stop for death, he kindly stopped for me. He stopped in his carriage, and he also stopped her internal clock.
Thank you. I think there's also a certain irony in that, isn't there? That we go on with our lives and we do have those eternal internal clocks, and that sometimes with disease or trauma we're stopped, maybe not for death, but it events make us think about death. And then when death does come to others, they're overcome and their internal clocks indeed stops. Shall I read the second stanza?
Yeah, sure.
We slowly drove, he knew no haste, and I had put away my labor and my leisure too for his civility.
So what does that make you think of?
That also, to me, is very ironic in that, well, that she put away her labor and leisure, but he still slowly drove her away into, first of all, after that, her past, the school, and then so forth. What did you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think that this provides a framework for, uh, or for a further framework for the the motif of the courtship. Um, he's driving slowly, aristocratically, with aristocratic slowness. He knew no haste. Of course, he doesn't know any haste because they have all the time in the world. um, and I had put away my labor and my leisure too for his civility. She has put away everything. She's dropped everything for his civility, for his overpowering, overmastering, um, genteel courtship, which
Yeah,
she also suggests, she may suggest there is a bit aggressive, say the least.
yeah. Did you want to read the next stanza?
Sure. We passed school where children strove at recess in the ring. We passed the fields of gazing grain. We passed the setting sun. Or rather, he passed us. I feel like that line, which is the first line of the next stanza, should be read as well. So, what are your thoughts about this?
Well, as I said before, she's on a trip looking uh, at her past the school and the children, and she's passing the fields of gazing grain, and then the setting sun, or rather, he passed us. What does, or rather, he passed us, suggest to you, Dr. Hamilton?
Good question. Well, I mean, I think that in this stanza, first of all, what we see is I think I agree. We see her having a kind of flashback. Going and revisiting her past, her childhood, and looking out of the window of the carriage and seeing images from her past, and then she sees these fields of gazing grain, and you think that that might symbolize kind of the harvest of her life, her life's work, perhaps. But this wonderful phrase, "gazing grain," is is very evocative, and to me, it suggests the glassy gaze of death. And so on the one hand, the fields of gazing grain are like the life's harvest, her life's work. On the other hand, they're like glassy eyes staring. And I think it suggests that as she's progressing on this journey, everything that she's done in life is becoming more and more alien to her, more and more distant from her. Then they pass the setting sun, right? I mean, it becomes more and more surreal. Or rather, he passed us. So, in the first sense, in the first line, we pass the setting sun. You're thinking that they have sort of transcended time. You can't pass the setting sun, can you? Um, how do you pass the setting sun? We've if the sun symbolizes time, then it suggests we've passed time, except that she corrects herself by saying, or rather, he passed us. In other words, they've been driving at this leisurely pace. They have all the time in the world, and now the sun itself has passed them by. In other words, time is going on without them.
Yes. Yes.
And it's right at that moment that she starts to feel cold. So do you want to
Yeah.
read that part?
Yes. The dews drew quivering and chill for only gossamer my gown, my tippet only tulip. There
So
she's gets cold and quivering. But what were you going to say, Dr. Hamilton?
well, I mean, I think that here she picks up from earlier. She picks up an idea from earlier in the poem that she could not stop for death. She was hurrying on with her life, and death takes her by surprise, as it takes all of us by surprise. And And so at this moment, she realizes, and it's a wonderful moment. She realizes she's not dressed for this occasion. She's in her gown, her gossamer gown. She has a scarf, a tippet, but it's like a webbed scarf that the wind can just blow through and chill her to the bone. She's not dressed for this. She's not prepared. She doesn't have the right clothing. It's such a wonderful idea that one of her last thoughts before she traverses this chasm between time and eternity is, I'm not dressed for this.
Yeah.
Where is my warm coat?
We paused before a house that seemed a swelling of the ground. The roof was scarcely visible, the cornice in the ground. And as you remarked before, that she sees her grave, and again, it's interesting going back to the uh, her cold, her feeling of chill, is that she feels the human sensation still, doesn't she? But then in the next stanza is a foreboding of her grave.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, they arrived at at her final destination, the swelling of the ground. And it's at this point, you know, where the poem starts becoming really surreal. So the roof was scarcely visible, the cornice in the ground. Somehow there's a sense of this um, expansive sense that this house that they've arrived at has this very, very tall roof that she can barely see the ceiling, and yet the cornice, which is the piece of architecture that is right at the top. Cornice means crown in Latin. It's right at the top of the uh, the house. You know, the grave is in the ground, and so there's this profound sense of disorientation. This is like a you know a paradox or an oxymoron in the sense that somehow the top is in the ground, and yet the roof is overhead is so expansive that she can barely see the ceiling, and um and and she has she has passed past the setting sun, or rather, he's past us. The sense that they're exiting time, but now space is also um, becoming surreal and disorienting.
Yes. And then time, uh, since then to centuries, and yet feels shorter than the day I first surmised the horse's head were toward eternity. Uh, this eternity is endless. And what do you think about time in that time and eternity in that last stanza?
Well, I mean, I think that you know this is just it's so elegantly written. I mean, but I think that you know she just conveys the awesomeness of exiting time, and also entering this new and utterly surreal dimension. It's almost like she's passing through this dimension into another dimension. Suddenly, she arrives at this house, which is her grave. The roof is scarcely visible, the cornice in the ground, the sense of this vast space um, that is yet underground, and that is yet below the ground. It's reminiscent of the poem "I Felt a Funeral in My Brain" when she writes, "And then a plank in reason broke, and I dropped down and down and hit a world at every plunge, and finished knowing then. And then a plank in reason broke." Um, the image from the other poem, "I Felt a Funeral in My Brain," the plank in reason, she's the plank is a plank from a an execution, from a what do you call a gibbet, you know, where you are hanged. You know, the plank breaks, and I drop down and hit a world at every plunge. There's a similar sense in which reason starts to break down, starts to collapse here, and the terrain just becomes more and more surreal as she passes from, 3 dimensions to 4 dimensions, or 5 or 11, and suddenly the there are these sort of impossible proportions, that she's experiencing. And then in that final stanza, which is again reminds us that the whole poem is told from the point of view of uh, the past tense, the person who's already died, and is describing this event. So it's told from the point of view of eternity. That from she's saying, since then 'tis centuries. So from this from then, from the point of view that she's describing, centuries have passed, and she's actually written this poem from the point of view of eternity, from the point of view where centuries have passed, and yet it feels shorter than the day. I first surmised the horse's head were toward eternity. The shorter than the day, those centuries are suddenly telescoped into, into hours. And we're left with that last sort of her sort of last awareness that the horses are taking her to eternity.
Yes. Um, that last part is really shows her ability to write about, to depict time and eternity, not be afraid of speaking about death and then after death, if you will. Should we go on to the poem about the clock?
Sure. Yeah. Would you like to read it, or would you like me to read it?
Could you read it, please?
Sure. Yeah. So this is the poem that I alluded to earlier when we were talking about the lines, "Because I could not stop for death, he kindly stopped for me." And I think that most people, when they read that poem, they won't, that word stop uh, won't register on them as being as important as it is. It's a word that can refer to a clock or stopping, as well as, a carriage stopping to pick someone up. And so that word is doing a lot of work in that poem. And I think that it's good for us to discuss this poem, "A Clock Stopped," because it helps you to understand uh, what Dickinson is investing in that language, and how she's thinking about time and eternity. So, sorry, do you want me to read it, or do you want to read it?
Yes, would you read it, please?
Sure. A clock stopped, not the mantles. Geneva's farthest skill cannot put the puppet bowing that just now dangled still. An awe came on the trinket, the figures hunched with pain, then quivered out of decimals into degreeless noon. It will not stir for doctors, this pendulum of snow. The shopman importunes it, while cool, concernless, no. Nods from the gilded pointers, nods from the second slim, decades of arrogance between the dial life and him. Okay, so we can start by discussing the first stanza, if you'd like. I'll just reread that first stanza, and then we can comment. A clock stopped, not the mantles. Geneva's farthest skill cannot put the puppet bowing that just now dangled still. So, what are your thoughts about that?
Well, that is really picturesque of the puppet just dangling there. And to me, she's experienced someone's death. As we've talked before about Emily Dickinson's attendants and assistant at deathbeds from tuberculosis or other diseases. She she had experienced firsthand other people's deaths, as many did during and after the Civil War. But that puppet dangling is just a really reminder of death and the helplessness that one goes through and sometimes in dying, and then a clock, someone's internal clock stopped. What do you think, Dr. Hamilton?
Yeah, I mean, I think that this is a really disturbing stanza. So the clock clearly symbolizes somebody who's died. A clock stop, not the mantles. So a clock, in other words, somebody has died. Their heart has stopped beating, not the mantles. Geneva's farthest skill. Geneva is the region in Switzerland that's famous for clockmaking. Cannot put the puppet bowing that just now dangled still. So she's continuing this analogy in the second part of that stanza. Geneva's farthest skill cannot put the puppet bowing that just now dangled still, suggesting that the clock that cannot be resuscitated, that cannot be set back, can't be fixed by Switzerland's most skilled clockmakers. That this clock uh, is depicted as having this puppet, like a big, like a mantle, a clock on the mantle a that has a puppet that comes out to ring the hours, and this puppet is described as dangling still. And so if the clock symbolizes the person that's died, the puppet also is sort of almost like a sardonic commentary or a sardonic pantomime of the person dying, the person hunched over and dangling still like a puppet, um, that in a broken clock. And that image of the puppet, that is sort of pops out of the clock and dangles still is just a very dark, disturbing, sardonic image of somebody who has died.
Yes, and the stanza and all came home a trinket, the figures hunched with pain. It was a painful death, then quivered out of decimals into degreeless noon. What did you think about those two lines, the ending two lines of the second stanza?
Well, I think that so the second stanza continues this analogy, so that when she's comparing the person who died to the clock, and yet what this imagery suggests, and awe came on the trinket, the figures hunched with pain. This is an image of a person, staring at a clock, and awe came on the trinket, the figures hunched with pain, as if they're looking at the clock as they're dying.
Yes.
Then quivered out of decimals into degreeless noon. So, once again, the image, if the clock is being compared to the person who's dying, they're quivering out of the decimals that record time into degreeless noon, into a an eternity where that is not measurable by degrees. Noon is also a word that Emily Dickinson uses to represent eternity. It is the midpoint in the day, but it is also two no's put together. When you look at the word, it's no, and then o, noon, no, and then on. So it's two no's put together into a to suggest a double cancellation, and so she's once again, this is very similar. Because I could not stop for death, he kindly stopped. I could not stop. And when you think about that in relation to that line, then in relation to this one, you can see how there's a hidden kind of clock imagery, or time imagery that is sort of very subtly suggested there in that first poem that we described. I should also mention that, why does she use a clock as the symbol for a person dying? Well, it's a natural metaphor on the one hand, but it also allows her scope symbolically to allude to something else, and that is to a very famous proof for the existence of God, by Paley. Paley's proof for the existence of God. And in Paley's proof for the existence of God, God is a watchmaker, and the universe is compared to a watch or a clock. And his proof is that because the universe is so finely tuned, like a watch, that it must be true that we can infer a watchmaker, somebody who made the watch or made the clock. And this allows Dickinson to imply that the creator of this watch or this clock, to suggest that the creator of this watch or this clock is at best somebody who has a really sick and disturbing sense of humor, if he allows the objects of his creation to die in such horrific, humiliating, degrading, debased ways.
Yes. And I wanted to go on just a moment to the next stanza.
Sure.
It will not stir for doctors, this pendulum of snow. The shopman importunes it, while cool, concernless, no. There again she uses no, and as you were discussing, and the coldness of death. I mean, the imagery of the snow and the cool, concernless snow, and as in, because I could not stop for death, that chill and coldness was depicted. So it is also in this stanza.
Yes, absolutely. And yeah, sorry. Did you want to say more?
Well, it leads on to the next stanza, but go ahead. You might want to say something about this stanza.
Well, yeah. So it will not serve for doctors is pendulum of snow. So once again, she's saying that the person who's died, who's being compared to a clock, that this person cannot be brought to light. This pendulum of snow. And then she introduces a new figure. The shopman importunes it, while cool, concernless know. So who is the shopman? The shopman importunes it, while cool, concernless know. The shopman is another figure, and the shopman is the person who has lost this this who has lost somebody, the person who's going to mourn the death. And the shopman importunes it, while cool, concernless know. So for the shopman, life goes on, time goes on. Whereas for the person who's died, um, the person who's died has quivered out of decimals into degreeless noon, and the shopman, for the shopman, time goes on, and the 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 response is this cool, concernless no. And as you pointed out, another reference to this no, this absolute no that that death presents us with, um, this absolute negation or obstacle.
Yes. And then nods from the gilded pointers, nods from second slim. Decades of arrogance between the dial life and him. I think decades of arrogance really fascinates me because to me it depicts the we in a sense are ignorant of of the life cycles. It's ironic that we sometimes don't treasure life, and we think that we go on forever. And as Dr. Hamilton said, the clock is a symbol of that we don't go on forever. It's the first phrase in the whole poem is the clock stopped.
Yes, and in this final stanza, we get another view, another image of the clock, but not the clock as an analogy for the person who died, but the clock that is the time that goes on after the person has died. And now in this last stanza, there's a transition to this figure of the shopman who has been importuning, who has been begging the the um, the person to come back, uh, who the person who cannot come back, and now this person who has lost, who is mourning for the death of someone, is looking at the clock and the hours going by, the hours that he is himself still enslaved to, the time that he is still enslaved to. And as he's looking at those hours that go by, those seconds, those minutes, those hours, those days, he's seeing the gilded pointers of the clock going round and round and nodding and nodding. And um, the nodding, the way that I read this nodding is that it's nodding in laughter. That the clock is actually laughing at him, laughing because he is trapped in time, and his friend or his lover or his relative is now in eternity, and that there is that implacable, insurmountable barrier now, and now decades of arrogance between the dial life and him, between the life of the clock and the person who has died. Decades of arrogance.
Exactly.
decades of wasted time, decades of what Emerson called the life of exaggeration, that the time seeming to stretch out for decades as the lost person, between him and the person that has been lost, decades that are ridiculous, merely a more of a prison, and that laugh at him as the hours pass. They laugh at him as he cannot reach the person who he has lost. That's how.
Yeah.
What were your how do you read it?
Well, I thought of a line by the great poet Robinson Jeffers that relates to me, and the line is, "Beauty will remain when there is no heart left to beat for it." Or maybe that's not a complete line, but I'll repeat it. Beauty remains when there's no heart left to beat for it, so that eternity may go on beyond us and it went on before us, but it just continues, and we stop in a sense with the clock, and then perhaps go into eternity. But you might want to talk more about it, and then I have one of my poems I can close with.
Yes. Well, I mean, I think that anybody who has lost someone knows what it's like to feel like time is just stretching eternally in front of them, and that while the person who's lost seems to have escaped from time, and then you seem to be left alone, stuck to live out the rest of your life when this person has sort of gotten out of it, gotten away. And so I think that sense of um, time as as sort of mocking the person is very powerful, and I think that's you get that because of these like nods from the gilded pointers, nods from the seconds slim. It's not the gilded pointers, you know, nodded. It's nods from um laughter from. So, but before we get to the final poem that you want to refer to, I want to just at least point out that there's another poem about time and eternity that Dickinson wrote, that captures this sense of where we are in time, and that is "Behind Me Dips Eternity." And so, do you have that poem?
No, I don't
Okay,
have it right
I
with me, but I can.
let me just mention it briefly. I'll read it and then let me mention it briefly. But I think that um, because you're ending that one by talking about time stretching, endlessly, seemingly into the future. Um, so this is a poem really that I absolutely love, about the way that where we are in time. I mean, I think we realize maybe dimly and vaguely that we're at this point in space, and that space stretches, in this vast ocean that is incomprehensibly large. And but writing here about time. Behind me dips eternity, before me immortality, myself the term between. Death but the drift of eastern gray dissolving into dawn away before the west begin. 'Tis kingdoms afterward, they say, in perfect pauseless monarchy, whose prince is son of none, Himself, his dateless dynasty, himself diversify, in duplicate divine. 'Tis miracle before me then, 'tis miracle behind between, crescent in the sea, with midnight to the north of her and midnight to the south of her, and maelstrom in the sky. So, I mean, she imagines that the term of our existence is this period that is sort of sandwiched between an eternity behind us and an immortality before us. And she imagines this as a crescent in the sea, like a sailing ship, with midnight to the north of her and midnight to the south of her, and maelstrom in the sky. I think that's a wonderful image to kind of transition to your poem.
Yes, I love the way that she depicts herself in the midst of eternity and time. It's just amazing what she can do with the American language. Do you want me to read this now? Or
Yeah.
you want...
Yeah, that was great. Uh-huh.
Yeah, this poem is optimistic, yet I talk about spirit and spirit being transcending all and being the kind of the rotator of the universe, so to speak, called awaiting night's darkness. Awaiting night's darkness with hope and joy. This comforts me, envelops me in sweetness. Black beautifies my moments, angels' ecstasy and motion. Spirit transcends all, moves the universe. Light illuminates through us.
Oh, that's really gorgeous. Is that the end?
Yes.
Yeah, that's really gorgeous. Very visionary. We will post these poems for you on the in the information section of the podcast, so you can read them yourself. And I'll provide links to the Dickinson poems.
Right. Yeah, that's pretty self-explanatory, except that I really believe that there's a spirit that transcends everything and, as I say, moves the universe, and we're enveloped in light. And indeed, I believe we can become part of spirit again.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a very fitting way for us to end the podcast. I mean, this image of eternity shimmering through the veil, so to speak. And was there anything else that you wanted to add there?
No, I just wanted to say it's been exciting to speak to everyone, and I hope you enjoy the poems, and we'll meet again.
Yeah, yeah. And I want to thank everybody as well for joining us here in our hopefully expansive and far-reaching discussion about time and eternity and Emily Dickinson and Professor Reeve and her poetry. Please join us again for another one of our podcasts, and we look forward to seeing you and connecting with you here and online. All right. Thank you very much, and thanks so much for being here with me tonight, Professor Reeve, and we will finish it with that. Thanks, everybody.